Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly podcast where I take a look at a book I've been reading, have an author interview, and then something I've been looking at during the week. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us, for following us, subscribing. We ask you for your continued support and that you will recommend us to friends, relatives, neighbors, whomever, and that's how this thing grows, and that's how we can get good books out to each and every person. I also want to direct your attention to my website, viewsonbooks.com. And it's a good website in which I put all my book reviews about the books I'm reading and other books that might not make this podcast. Last week, as you remember, we did 80 Days, and that book review's on viewsonbooks.com. As a matter of fact, some books do extremely well. Yeah. If you remember, I did a book by Chris Wimmer, and there have been over 1,000 people have read my book review. Yeah, for a little independent guy who doesn't push too much, those are good numbers. So anyway, Books and Looks for the podcast. Also, it's on audio, YouTube, if you need to do it that way. And then we have viewsonbooks.com. And again, all this is brought to you by the good folks at Podcast Studio X. We're talking today with Nev March. Now, Nev March is one of my favorite authors. She is an Indian American, and she writes a wonderful, wonderful series of books about Captain Jim and Lady Diana, and they are, again, obviously from India. And we start out, and it's now in book 3, and this is her third book. It's called The Spanish Diplomat's Secret. And it's a locked room mystery that takes place on a ship. So you're really locked and locked. I mean, you can't get anybody coming in because it's set in 1894. And this is a really fine book. And one thing I like about Nev, and you'll find out, is that her books are all filled with great historical facts. Wonderful research that she did, and she's done some great stuff on this book in particular, but she's telling us about things that went on in Cuba, things that went on in Spain, things all over, and how it affects things. It's a really well-done book. She, again, for all of you out there, she is another one of my authors who had a career before she began writing. You know, we've gone and talked to a few ladies this fall who've had that. Nev worked 25 years in business, and then she started writing. And she always loved to write. She's going to tell you all about that, but she'll tell you how she worked 25 years before she actually got down to writing the books in this series. So it's fantastic. We go into that. We talk a little bit about the fact that one of her characters is a Zoroastrianist. I was unaware, but I'm aware of that religion, but don't know much about it. But apparently that's a big regional religion in India. Never knew that. Again, lots of things. When you read Nev's books, you don't just get a great mystery. You get a lot of good history with it. And she's going to talk to us about that. So without any further ado, let's go right into my interview with Nev March talking about The Spanish Diplomat's Secret. Nev, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you.
Glad you could make it. You're a busy person. Your book has already come out, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. Book 3, The Spanish Diplomat's Secret, is out.
And it's doing well from what I hear?
Yeah, it's only been out a couple of weeks, and we have about 200 reviews on Goodreads. I'm always thrilled when that happens. Good to see.
Great. Glad to hear it. That's wonderful books. Before we get talking about these books, and it's a great series, as you said, book 3, you had a career prior to becoming an author. What was your background?
Yeah, so I have multiple degrees in economics. I have a degree in health policy, and I had about 25 years in corporate America in data sciences, market research, forecasting, market access. I worked for pharmaceutical companies as well as consulted for companies that serve pharmaceutical companies. So, it was a busy and active career and a very busy life.
It was. So when did you start writing? It's always been a passion, I heard, but when did you actually begin writing?
It's been a passion for many, many years. I started writing short stories when I was about 11. My mother actually kept them. Incredible as it may seem. I shudder to read them, of course, but that was the training, and I just couldn't stop. I wasn't showing them to anybody. I didn't do very much with them. 2 of them actually got published before I was 20 in children's magazines, that should have given me an inkling that this might be a good career. But at the time, it was find the corporate niche, and I was good at math and so on. So I kept going with my college education. What made me start writing was somewhere in my 20s, I started a novel, and I was actually writing with paper on legal-sized pads, paper and pen. And I finished one manuscript and I started another. Again, I wasn't showing these to anyone. It was my secret hobby. It was just something that would help me process things that were going on. Although most of what I was writing was historical fiction. It wasn't even historical mysteries. It was maybe closer to historical romances, because I was writing about medieval times and so on. And it was just a way of being in another world. I actually started writing, let's say, professionally after I got laid off from my corporate career. And, the usual stuff happens. They're closing one department. They give you an opportunity to be in another department, a different salary and whatnot. And I was going, okay, this is a moment of truth. My children are grown. What do I want to be doing for the next 30 years? And I thought, let's go back to writing and give it a shot. And if it doesn't work out and nobody's interested in it in 3 years, maybe, okay, I'll go back and take another job. You have to do something with the rest of your life. But it did take off.
It certainly did. And I think you're now the third or fourth straight lady who I've had on here who started writing after the age of 30. And I always encourage people, look at these successful women, these successful writers. Even if you don't start at age 15 or 20, you can still become a great author, no matter what your age. And, well, did you take any creative writing courses, or was that just sort of within you, all that creativity?
I did. I took every course I could find that was online. I still have a couple of them open on my tabs. I'm constantly doing webinars. I read through entire books and did every exercise. The Gotham Writers Workshop has a wonderful workbook. So even if you're not near the city or you can't join their online classes, at least get the book and work through every single exercise. And I did that with a dozen books. So I pretty much applied my overused academic skills to teaching me this one. And I think it's really just, as Stephen King says, read a lot, write a lot. I was always a voracious reader, reading fast, but I would read, despite my busy life, I would read at least a dozen books a year. Now it's closer to 30 or 40, but it's a way for me to let my mind have a vacation without going anywhere. So I finish all the chores that I have to do at home and give myself a day off from writing or anything else and just dive into a good book. I love that.
That's great. This book, which The Spanish Diplomat's Secret, is your third book, and it's part of what's called the Captain Jim and Lady Diana series. Now, could you briefly tell us a bit about these two characters? Who are they and how did they meet, the whole background?
Okay, so they meet in book one, Murder in Old Bombay, and that book is based upon a real tragedy that has never been solved. It is still unsolved after 130 years. And it happened within my community, which is the Parsi Zoroastrian community. If you're curious, Zoroastrianism was the state religion of the Persian Empire. And the first Parsi Zoroastrians, my community, are the descendants of medieval refugees who escaped the Arab invasion of Persia and landed up on the shores of India, Gujarat, and have been there and spread all over the world now for, we migrated about, say, 1,100 years ago. And the descendants of that group of refugees are now, there's 25,000 in the States, there's another 10,000 in Canada, they're all over the world. That was the genesis, that mystery of those two girls who died falling from the top of a university clock tower. And that was the genesis of my first book. And in it, I modeled the client. In Holmes stories, you always have Holmes and Watson sitting there smoking whatever they're doing, and then a client shows up. So the client was modeled over the husband of one of those two victims. He actually ended up being quite an important person in Indian history. His name is Ardeshir Godrej, the real person. And after his 20-year-old bride died. This 22-year-old law student, he never remarried, by the way, he was heartbroken, but he went on to become a serial entrepreneur, and he founded, I think, about 17 different businesses that are today the Godrej Foundation. It's an enormous conglomerate in India. But I don't use their name, of course, because the descendants are still alive. I created the name Framji. It's just a common Parsi name. So Adi Framji really was, he did exist. He's modeled on a real person. But the two characters that have entranced me, really, are the detective and his love interest. So I created this character, and it seems so strange to say I created, because he really just popped up from nowhere. I wanted a detective who had, he had to have the chops. He's going to be in a harsh world in colonial India and during the British rule and so on. So I thought, well, what did guys do at the time? I mean, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, was a boxer. It was very common to be a boxer. So I thought, all right, he's going to be a boxer, but he'll be a little bit of a beat-up soldier, someone who is invaliding out of the army. And so we meet him on the first page of Murder in Old Bombay when he's in hospital. He's an interesting character because there are so many layers. And as I write more, I discover more about him. And he talks to me. This is going to sound so schizophrenic.
You didn't know how layered he really was, see?
Yes. Well, I had no idea. But he has opinions on everything. As I go through my day, I could be in the grocery store and he'll have opinions on the people at the line. So he's a very gentle soul, but he's also a little cynical. And then, of course, because he's mixed race, he's delighted when the Framji family, his clients, kind of adopt him. So he makes the cardinal sin of falling in love with his client's family. In the first book, Holmes is always so emotionally remote and so detached. He, in fact, encourages Watson to be detached. Of course, I'm a total Holmes addict. Every book, every story ever written, and I've read them multiple times. But there's always this very intellectual, cerebral way that he approaches things. And I just thought, I want a hero that feels things, that makes mistakes, that gets beat up, that gets into trouble, and doesn't always succeed. Sometimes he has to struggle to succeed. So Captain Jim is that guy. And of course, being mixed race, that became the heart of the first book, because there are so many social issues that arise when you start to explore a topic. So he falls in love with Diana, who is the English-returned, English-educated sister of his client. And then I had to explore, what was it like to be a woman in those times, even a privileged woman? You're still bound by all these social rules and regulations and norms, expectations. Your life is very constrained. So Diana is a Victorian woman who doesn't follow the rules. So she's young. She's only in 2021 in the first book. I think maybe she turns 21 in the first book. And he's about a decade older. So there's going to be a vast difference in the way they view the world, and their dynamic was just so intoxicating. So Diana is perky. She is impulsive. She's very insightful, and she knows how to use the system because she's been brought up with money. And those privileges, I think they create a certain type of personality. She hates to break things, so she is very soft-hearted. But by the same token, she is somewhat entitled. I don't know how you cannot be entitled. But she's a representation of all the spunky girls I knew growing up. So she makes mistakes too, but they're hilarious. Book 2 is really her book. It was such a romp. They come to America and he goes off on a job because this is what he does. It's his job to go off and investigate things. But then he gets lost and he can't come home, or he disappears, and then Diana has to go hunt him down. I thought that was just the tables turned. So she's the sleuth in the second book.
Right. Now that's called Perils at the Exposition?
Peril at the Exposition, yes. I love to turn the tropes on their head.
Right. I loved that book, and I loved how she sort of took over and she was the detective there. She did a great job. I really liked that. You now decide to go a little bit different. Now you're going to go and you're going to take Captain Jim and Lady Diana. They're going back to England. So now we have this book, The Spanish Diplomat's Secret, and this whole thing is based upon a lot of historical events. Just tell us a little bit about what this is all about, this book.
Absolutely. So each of my books is based on things that really happened. Maybe I take a little bit of liberty with when they happened. I might move them, from 1 month to another month, but usually in the same year. And then I put disclaimers at the end in case, someone's really picky about these things. Or mea culpa, I did it, I know I did it. But the second book, for example, has 6 real events that did happen, but I've strung them together to make the story. All the strange things in that book really happened. I made up all the regular things, the weird things really happened. In book 3, Spanish Diplomat's Secret, we're now in 1894, okay? So we're on a transatlantic steamship. Captain Jim and Diana are going back from New York to Liverpool. So again, I like to break tropes because when people write the first book in India, they imagine that every book is going to end up being in India. No, people have traveled. Asians traveled, Africans traveled, everybody traveled. Sometimes willingly, sometimes not. But they did. They moved around, and I love having an international cast of characters. So yes, we have them on a ship. They're going back to Liverpool, to England, but there's a couple of things going on that not all of them are aware of. Captain Jim has a reason for going back. He's received a telegram from Uddy, and we won't know till the end of that book what that's about. But Diana thinks he has a job. He's been asked to go there on a job, which he has. He's volunteered for a job in England. And the story of that job in England is actually a short story that will come out in a couple of months. I think December or January, there will be a short story about that job. I'm reading book 4 right now. So I've already taken them from England back to Bombay. Yeah, like I said, I like to break tropes. In book 3, Spanish Diplomat's Secret, we've got a couple things going on. If you remember, the Spanish-American War was over Cuba, and that was at the end of that century, like 1898, I want to say. This is just a few years before. So a few years before that war, what was happening? America was not the top dog. America was a tiny military power, if at all. We had very few ships, certainly no warships. And then there's this enormous tension between the two big world powers, that was Spain and England. France to some extent, but Napoleon had been conquered. And after that, there was all kinds of stuff with France. But the real issue was Spain. It had these enormous global ambitions, enormous footprint in South America, right on the doorstep of America. They had occupied Cuba, and that turned out to be, it was very interesting to learn about that era, because while I knew academically about the Spanish-American War, I didn't realize all the factions, the fault lines, the limitations that the U.S. was under, and the fact that it was so close posed an imminent threat. So I did have a lot of real incidents that I picked up from books, from the internet, from research, from listening to all kinds of historical podcasts and historical recordings that revealed a lot of layers of what was going on in Cuba, particularly, and in Spain. I had no idea of Spain's history, what a difficult time Spain had becoming a democratic nation. So there's just so much European history that I think is fascinating and is very little known in this country.
Yep, you're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Well, now, okay, page 1, you capture me, and they're on a luxury ocean liner, Diana and Jim, and you start describing the people, the luxuries. Did you do a lot of research onto what the cruise ships were like back then?
Absolutely. So they're on this luxury ocean liner, which was the only way to get anywhere, right? Cars hadn't come into use really in 1894. There were no planes. So you had to, if you couldn't trust the continent, you had to go on a big ship. 8,000 gross tons is what this ship was. It was considered, a big ship, the Etruria and the Umbria. But just to put that into context, the Titanic, which was launched only like 2 decades after this era, was many times bigger. But how big do you think today's cruise ships really are? And I had to go back to Wikipedia and look this up. They are roughly 133 gross tons, like many, many times bigger than this one. So even though it was big for the time, 1,000 people on board, by today's standards, it was fairly small. But then we have a diplomat that dies on the ship, right? He's killed, gruesomely killed. But he's just spoken to Captain Jim, and he's even written to him, like, to see me right away. So something's up. But Captain Jim, of course, has to solve the locked room mystery. There's a closed set mystery because the murderer can't leave the ship. And, of course, he's seasick.
One of the things that I found fascinating, Nev, really fascinating, was that they buried this diplomat at sea. They didn't try to keep his body on ice. Weren't they doing that back then?
So, no, it was bad luck to carry a dead body across, a body of waters, an ocean. Remember that refrigeration had only just arrived on ships. Prior to this, you actually carried animals on board so that they would be slaughtered and you would have food for the whole journey. So like a week, you have all these very wealthy people on board. You have to feed them well. This is expected. Luxury food and dining, and refrigeration had only just been invented. So this was a ship that did have refrigeration. It did have electricity, which is very early when electricity was brought on board. They had its own generators. But it was coal-fueled, so you had these massive boilers, and you had the people in the boiler room, the engine room, putting coal into furnaces that would heat up these enormous boilers to turn the screw, the propeller. But it's very early in the development of the ships, not just in navigation, because it was single screws. It didn't even have two propellers, very early. And this is part of the research that I learned. They didn't even have swimming pools. Swimming pools were not on board. They did have something called Turkish baths. But because of all these features, you didn't have the luxury of keeping the body and bringing it home for a proper burial. So, yeah, they were still doing their burial at sea, and the words used are the actual words that would have been said over the body as it was slid into the waves.
Like I said, friends, this is the historical research that goes into this book. I mean, Nev does a spectacular job of researching anything. And you may think, oh, well, that's just a throwaway line. No, that's been researched, and it's there for a reason. And it's awfully, awfully good. And I tell you, you can't beat this. But we start moving into this book, and all of a sudden, we've got ghosts and superstitions popping up. Tell us about this. Did you have a favorite ghost? I don't know.
There are so many superstitions that are attached to this sea. I made a whole list of them, and I didn't even use them all. There are so many, and they're delightful. So anytime that you have a group of people that are not in control of their surroundings, they're feeling very vulnerable. You have histories of myths and legends and beliefs and what people think they saw, and they tend to grow. You have to remember this is a time before cell phones, before any kind of phones, they did have cables. Telegraph did exist, and I think local city phones did exist, but you didn't have transcontinental phones. Certainly you didn't have telegraph on the ship. This is before telegraph was available to ships. So you have stories. You have people sitting there. What are they going to do with their time? They tell each other stories. And of course, the stories that everybody loves are ghost stories. But this is October. So we have a whole month devoted to ghosts and myths and ghost stories. And of course, there's a lot of those on the ship. Each culture brings its own. And so because we have these different cultural elements on the ship, you have all these nationalities. You have a couple of people from the islands, a couple of Jamaicans on board. Then, of course, Captain Jim. He's kind of a guy who will work. He'll talk to laborers. He'll talk to the captains. He'll talk to the fancy people, the rich and the wealthy and the poor and everybody. So, of course, he's going to get told all these strange stories and myths. But it's part of the ambiance of the book that once you had one strange thing happen, which is the horrible murder of this elderly guy, frail elderly guy, then more strange things start to take on an ominous importance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you what, there are a lot of these things. Then, like I said, we have some ghosts that are involved, and they all put together as the book goes on. We get more myths, more ghosts, more superstitions. Jim is befuddled. Captain Jim doesn't have any idea what's going on, okay? But I always think, based on what you have written in book 1 and then definitely book 2, that she is the one. Jim's the detective, but she's almost like the power behind the throne. She can intuitively see what's happening, and he can't.
Yes, they work very differently. And I think that both types of thinking are important. The methodical, systematic thinking is absolutely the bedrock of all science, but it's also detection. And that's how, Jim has been trained. He's studied the Holmes books, and he's a fan, and he wants to be very methodical. And everything should be explained. That's the bottom line for him. Reality is all. And Diana's a little bit more insightful, yes, whimsical perhaps. It's her youth. She's been a reader, but she's pecked at various types of books and literature, and she's a spontaneous thinker. So yes, often in many of the books, she detects something. This thing called intuition, and I don't want to call it women's intuition because men have plenty of intuition as well. This thing called intuition is really us interpreting information, and then it's a question of how much credence we give it. So she gives it a lot of credence. She believes and trusts in her own insights and her own feelings about things. Whereas Jim being skeptical, Captain Jim tends to be skeptical about everything. So then which element of his intuition is he going to pay attention to? He records everything. He makes systematic notes. He goes back to the notes. He does explore. He hunts down every clue. Maybe not immediately, but he will always get to it. But she is more spontaneous and erratic in a way, which is a little annoying for people who are methodical thinkers. But I think both kinds of thinking are very valuable.
It's a locked room mystery because the Spanish diplomat is killed in a room, public room as a matter of fact, on the boat. And again, you have a locked room in a locked situation because obviously no one came onto the boat and no one could go off the boat. So someone's there somehow, and now these two are trying to figure it out. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, but then you bring stuff up. Again, I learned so much, Nev, when I read your books. What is this basis of mens rea, and what is that all about? How does that figure into this book?
Yeah, so that is Spanish history. So Spain had uprisings in the 1800s, and numerous uprisings which were quelled very ruthlessly. It was essentially the Catalonian group or the Basque group that was looking for independence, and they were considered rebels and terrorists in a way, and they were hanged and they were shot at and they were slaughtered. But ultimately, the monarchy was overthrown in Spain, and there were multiple factions. So who would take the control in order to create a sort of peaceful situation and a peaceful transition? There was a deal struck, and the deal was called the basis de Manresa. Basically, that is a sharing of power between two political parties. Remember, the political parties were all nobility. They were all wealthy people. They were all essentially either related to each other or all part of that same cohort of nobles. And one group was very faithful to the monarchy, but essentially made a deal with the other group as well. And they would share power. So you had few years where one party became in power and had the presidency and so on. And then the other party would take over, and it was a peaceful transition. But the people weren't really well represented in either case. But this was just a way of appeasing the leaders of the party, and they would promptly, undo everything that the other party had done. Meanwhile, they had a titular monarchy, so they were just there. They put a child king on the throne. He was like 8 or 9 years old at the time. And the country was really being ruled by his mother, who was an Austrian princess, not even Spanish. So very strange situation in that country.
And so this is all part, because I think, if my memory serves me correct, our Spanish diplomat has something to do with this, if I'm not mistaken, or there was a connection between him and that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So without giving out too many spoilers, because, part of that is the enjoyment of reading the book is all these surprises. Who was he? What did he actually do? What was his secret? Those are the three biggest questions in the book. But yes, there is a ticking clock, because ordinarily if there's a crime on board, when you wait, you come back to the dock, and then you get the investigative forces in and everybody gets questioned, and then there's a solution. It's called an inquest. Well, the captain cannot wait for that inquest because, again, there's this enormous tension between England and Spain at the time, and it's on an English ship that a Spanish diplomat is killed, so he will get blamed for it. He's also been told to take care of the old man, so it's the worst possible outcome, and he needs to have a solution to know who's responsible and, serve them up before the ship actually docks, which is in 6 days.
Yeah. Wow. Lots of fun characters there. Now, you did say you love Sherlock Holmes books. Okay. A, do you have a favorite book? And B, do you have a favorite actor who portrays Sherlock Holmes?
So I have distinct memories of being maybe 10 when my mother was reading these stories to us. Sometimes in the afternoons, summer afternoons, but sometimes it was on, bedtime tales. And thinking about that, like, wow, Mom, you were really courageous. You were reading this stuff to me before I went to bed. So the speckled band, the Hound of the Baskervilles, the Engineer's Thumb, okay, that is such an incredibly short and compact and delightful story. There are books like The Sign of the Four is actually about India. And then he has, stuff where the actual secret is about the Mormons, and then someone was chasing somebody, and then it all ends up in England. So there's history, a lot of historical fiction embedded in the Holmes stories. It is wonderfully inventive, but just a way that you learn about the whole world. So, of course, I adored all the Sherlock Holmes and the Christies. I get the Christies, too. I enjoy them tremendously. More modern ones. I love the Dashiell Hammett books, the Raymond Chandler books, the Elmore Leonard books. I have not read them all, but a good number of them. My favorite actor? Well, Benedict Cumberbatch does a fun job. There's Robert Downey Jr. does a fun job. But I have to go back to the older ones. Basil
Rathbone, yeah.
Yes. He did a fine job. The modern stories have given aspects of almost like a savant kind of genius to Holmes, which was not in the original books. In the original books, he's a guy who likes music. He does smoke opium and so on, but he wasn't quite as eccentric as we have made him in later years. I tend to like the old ones, the Basil Rathbone ones, a little bit more.
I also liked Jeremy Brett when he did his. Oh man, I loved his. Those are great.
Yes. The Jeremy Brett ones, love them. In fact, we loved watching him on TV.
Yep, good stuff. I'll tell you. You also quote Shakespeare a lot. Shakespeare shows up here. 1 minute we're quoting Holmes, then we're dealing with all these Spanish stuff. Now we go back to Shakespeare. I'm assuming you're a fan of Shakespeare's works? Well,
oh, yes. So, and thinking about what they would have read in those days, right? So Dickens was extremely popular, but he was pop culture at the time. Dickens would have been read by people as entertainment, but that was not proper classical fiction at the time because he was so new. He wrote in the 1800s, in middle 1800s. And he was still alive at this time. So they would have read Shakespeare and Homer as classics. Those would have been the proper education. And remember that Captain Jim is an orphan. He has not been to school ever. He was in an orphanage, so he had some kind of basic reading and writing education. But he's self-educated. And then, of course, in the army, he had someone, Colonel Sutton, who invested in him. And I think that is so important, that someone invests in a child. And Sutton, of course, had his own reasons. In the first book, we learned that he was training Captain Jim to be his boxer. And so whenever Captain Jim made him a lot of money, because they used to bet on boxing, then he would reward him with books or with tutors or quizzes or military history. And of course, an orphan boy is going to be desperate for attention. So have this wonderfully glorious senior officer taking an interest in him must have been the joy of his life, his poor bedraggled life. So Captain Jim has a penchant for Shakespeare. And he also has a chip on his shoulder. Because he knows he's not educated, everybody else seems very educated to him. So he's constantly, referring to whatever education he does have.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Makes sense. Hey, one of the things I like about this book and all your other books are what I call stragglers. Diana picks them up. She has all sorts of people she gets in her circle. I mean, she's got people, obviously, in India. She picked up a couple that were in Boston and everything, and now it looks like she's picking up some more here. Again, this is her personality? Is that what you planned from the beginning?
This happens. I didn't plan it from the beginning, but so much of this is based on our own family, right? So in the first book, you come across Diana's father, Berger, and he's modeled on two real people, one who has passed away, one who is still alive, that I saw and I experienced when I was quite young. So a quick story here. When I was young, every year we'd make a pilgrimage. That's a 3-hour, 4-hour car drive. We'd all get into Daddy's beat-up old car, which he actually cobbled together. It was an old Morris that didn't work that he put another engine into. And we get into that and we go off to Udvada, which is a pilgrimage place. It's where the first Zoroastrian fire came from Iran, from Persia, and they have it ensconced there. It's a lovely town, very small little village, actually. So we'd make that trip. And on the way back, we'd stop at family. We'd stop at Dhanu, where this family, Vakil family, Feroz Vakil and Ratim were the patriarch and matriarch of that family. They had 3 children. They were married. Their children were around. They had multiple servants. They had an enormous orchard. They were sending trucks of fruit to India, to Bombay, to the hotels and to the markets. So he had a big business there, farming business. But Feroz Vakil also had 6 family members, distant family members, and uncles, brothers, sons, wives, sister, somebody. They were all cared for. These are 6 seniors that he had in his home that would come to the meal, each with a servant at his elbow, some of them actually feeding them. So they were very old and very fragile. And this wonderful man, Feroz Vakil, was taking care of them in his own massive farmhouse. But that image is so beloved to me, so embedded in my mind. So, of course, Berger has this habit of, expanding his circle by adopting people. And, of course, Diana, the daughter, is going to do the same thing. Jim ends up getting a little bit of a found family in the first book where he picks up this bunch of orphans. They actually accost him.
Yeah.
But that was just a wonderful detour that I did not expect. Things happen that you don't expect as you're writing. So he has an affection for the disadvantaged as well. But I think it is Diana who has a soft heart, but is also very impulsive and doesn't always think things through. I mean, what do you expect of a 21-year-old who's suddenly been given, this independence? So, the strange things happen.
I love all those side characters you bring in who become part of her circle, and I just have the feeling that this circle will keep growing and may sometimes get involved in the mysteries. I don't know. We'll have to figure out. Now, we're not going to give anything away, okay? But there was something called the Virginius incident. What was the Virginius?
Yes, so it was a ship in, I want to say in 1873. Here's where things get a little murky, right? So there were, in Cuba, there were local Cubans, there were some slaves, there were some mixed race people called mulattoes, there were Spaniards who were, considered themselves a pure race. And so you had all these factions in Spain, and there was an incipient rebellion even as early as 1873. So now, this is all true. The rest I'm going to tell you is speculation. So I think that America was gun running. We were helping the rebels illegally under the table. This is total speculation. But essentially, there was a small ship called the Virginius. It was a side paddle steamer. So it had a paddle on the side of it, so it can't have been very fast. This is didn't even have a propeller at the back of it. Okay, so that old and that small. And it was caught off the coast of Spain. The sailors, the crew, the captain, his son were all taken prisoner, and 53 people were shot. They were killed, they were beheaded.
Oh, my.
Spain was within its right to do that because they were in Spanish territory, and Spain decided that they were helping the rebels. They thought that they were within their rights to do it. Now, whether they were really within their rights to do it is up for speculation, because those were foreign nationals. And typically you do not execute foreign nationals. You deport them, you bring the ambassador over and slay him, you yell at him, but you don't execute, foreign nationals. That's an act of war, actually. So this was done, and it became a bit of a stink, but the tragedy is that America was so weak at the time that it did not have a gunship to send to Cuba, to Santiago, to demand the return of the rest of the sailors. So England, which is far away, had to send a ship called the Niobe, which was a 60-gun warship. It threatened to fire on Santiago, and within 2 days, the rest of the sailors were brought home. But just imagine the awful situation for the American diplomats who were utterly helpless, watching this happen in front of their eyes and being utterly helpless. That was the Virginius incident.
Well, that's now we learned about the basis de Manresa. We learned about the Virginius affair. Friends, it all comes together in this book. I mean, it's just a wonderful book when you piece this whole thing together, and the research must just be voluminous and take not hours, days, weeks, and everything else. It just, I can't imagine all the research you have to do for this, Nev.
It is a lot of research. I'm still researching even when I'm doing revisions and edits. I do about 3 months of research before I even start the outline, and I agonize over outlines, so I keep changing them too. The outline gives me the illusion that I have enough to go on and start writing. But then, of course, it's an illusion because I'm constantly changing the outline. But they grow. The books just grow, and I love the research part of it. It is a dark hole. You can keep doing research till kingdom come. There's just so much wonderful information. But there's only so much that I can put into the story. So I try to keep the things that are in there are relevant. The things that are in there matter. There will be a reason why I put them in there.
That's right. That's right. Well, now, I got to ask this question. What's next for Nev March? What, are you doing another book in this series? You're going to move into something else? What do you have coming up?
So I have the 4th book underway, 25% of the way through. I hope to have the draft done by the end of the year, maybe January, and I had to turn it in by May. That's book 4. The couple is being forced to go back to Bombay. And remember, they left to escape a scandal, so now they're going to have to face the music. And it's such a joy to write. There are all these layers, as usual. I keep, I have to struggle with, well, wait, if I put this subplot in, will it completely, hijack the story? So some of that is happening, and I can't tell you more because I don't know more. It's still evolving. There will be a 5th book, I believe, in the series because I have enough material for it. I've been reading George Orwell's Man-Eater of Kumang. It's just a wonderful book. India's largest natural park, a conservated area, is called Jim Corbett National Park. And there's a reason for that. He didn't just shoot 200 man-eating tigers, but he also was a conservationist. So there's just a lot there. So I also, in my other life, I also work with seniors. I teach at the Rutgers Osher Institute once in a while, maybe 2 times or 3 times a year. I'll do that. I also run a senior program for our local Zoroastrian community, and I end up doing some of the edits on their memoirs. And this is a wonderful source material, so there will be a 5th book.
Okay, good. I'm happy. I'm happy to hear that. That's wonderful because you never know where you're going to get that little spark from, and that's just great. And I'll tell you what, friends, Nev has done great research and great work on little bits of history, which she expands for us. And I don't want to give things away for the future, but I got another lady coming on in 2 weeks who's writing a book or wrote a book called The East Indian. And it's about the first Indian to come to America in 1635. Again, the research you ladies do, I mean, it just blows my mind. You are wonderful. And so I can't say enough about Nev March. Her covers are outstanding. That's the first thing that drew me. Well, not the descriptions of the book were great. But then you see those covers of her book. Oh, friends, you want to get these books, so they're just spectacular. And, well, okay, I'm a fan number one. There you go. I have to admit it. Anyway.
Thank you. That's so wonderful to hear. Thank you.
I do love your writing. So anyway, I don't want to keep you any longer. We've probably kept you longer than we expected, but it's been worth it. I do appreciate it. And I hope you come back again when book 4 comes out. Will you do me that favor?
I would be delighted.
Great. Super, super. All right, friends, we'll be back in just a moment. Well, Nev, thanks so much for being with us today. And this is one heck of an interview. We really appreciate your time you spent with us. And, you know, folks, it's great when we can sit there and spend 30, 40, 45 minutes or longer speaking to authors. You just don't see that one or hear that on every podcast out there. So I'm very touched and honored that Nev would spend that much time with us. So anyway, hey, what am I looking at? Well, I think in honor of Nev being with us and talking to her today, I want to talk about, I'm looking at her other books in this series. That's right. Beginning with book 1, Murder in Old Bombay. Folks, it is a great beginning. It's about a mystery that's over 100 years old and has yet to be solved. Wait till you see the book cover on this. The drawing is absolutely beautiful, the book cover. It's spectacular. I'm telling you. Just great stuff. And the mystery, and again, the history of what happened, what led to a murder back in old Bombay, well over 100 years ago. Woo-hoo. This is still being talked about, so you don't want to miss that one. And her second book that I'm looking at, Peril at the Exposition, because you see, she started out with these two in India, and then they came to America. They settled up in Boston, and they then ended up with a job in Chicago at the World's Fair, or the Exposition back then. And he goes out there, Captain Jim, and they don't hear from him, so out goes Lady Diana. It's wonderful. It's filled with excitement, and I'm telling you what, the edge of your seat stuff. Folks, I've been looking at these books. I've read them all, and I recommend each and every one of them to you heartily. I really, really do. I think you start this series, this is one you're going to want to really enjoy. If you like good mysteries, you like well-researched books, well-written books, and a lot of great history, then I say take a look no further than my dear friend, Nev March. Anyway, folks, that concludes it for today. I appreciate you staying with us, and I hope you've enjoyed everything. So on behalf of ViewsOnBooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.